So today I want to take you inside a moment the world saw, but almost nobody truly understood on the 7th of April inside the United Nations Security Council. Something happened that looked simple on the surface. China and Russia vetoed a resolution related to the Strait of Hormuz. And within minutes, the Western narrative locked into place. China is backing Iran. Russia and China are shielding a destabilizing regime. They are risking the global economy to protect an ally. Simple story, fast story, wrong story. Because the question almost nobody stopped to ask is the only question that really matters. China is the world's largest buyer of Iranian oil. A huge portion of that oil moves through the Strait of Hormuz. If that route is blocked or destabilized, China is one of the biggest losers on the planet. So then why would China veto a resolution that supposedly aimed to reopen that route? Why would the country with the most to lose from disruption reject the so-called solution? That is the moment the whole chessboard flips. Because once you ask that question seriously, the story stops being about China protecting Iran. It becomes a story about strategy, leverage, legitimacy, and long-term control. It becomes a story about who gets to reopen the world as most important energy corridor and under whose authority. And once you see that clearly, the veto stops looking defensive. It starts looking calculated. In fact, I think it may have been one of the smartest strategic moves China has made in years. Now, let us slow down and unpack what actually happened, because the details matter more here than the slogans. On the 7th of April, a resolution originally proposed by Bahrain went to the Security Council. On paper, it sounded reasonable. Restore freedom of transit through the Strait of Hormuz. That sounds like common sense. But hidden inside the first draft was the phrase, all necessary means. And in diplomacy, that phrase is never innocent. It is not just wording. It is permission, permission for force, permission for escalation, permission for war wrapped inside legal language. That is why several countries immediately pushed back. China pushed back, Russia pushed back, even France pushed back. The resolution was then revised. The aggressive language was softened. The direct path to force was diluted. Then it was revised again. More authority was stripped out. The text became milder, narrower, more publicly saleable. And still China and Russia vetoed it. That matters because it means this was not just a disagreement over one phrase. It was a disagreement over the entire strategic direction hidden inside the resolution. The American and British line after the vote was predictable. China and Russia chose to shield Iran. They sided with the regime causing instability. They blocked a solution to a global problem. But that is a shallow reading because it assumes the only relevant question is whether the strait should reopen. That is not the real question. The real question is who gets to reopen it, by what means, under what legal logic, and with what long-term consequences. And that is where the Chinese calculation becomes much more sophisticated than the public narrative allows. Let us start with the first layer. If this resolution had passed, even in softened form, it would still have given the United States and its allies something extraordinarily valuable: legitimacy, not just power, power with approval. It would have meant the United Nations Security Council effectively endorsing a force-backed reopening of one of the most important maritime choke points on Earth. And once that happens, the meaning of the whole crisis changes, because now the world is watching America do more than restore shipping. It is watching America prove that even after years of decline talk, even after wars, debt, and overreach, it still has the ability to decide who gets access to energy and who does not. That matters enormously to China, because from Beijing's point of view, the nightmare is not merely high oil prices. The nightmare is dependency on American-controlled sea lanes, dependency on a world where the U.S. Navy can decide whether China's economy breathes freely or under permission. Chinese strategists have been thinking about this problem for decades. They have a name for one version of it, the Malacca Dilemma, the fear that the United States can choke China's economy by controlling key maritime passages. Now imagine that same vulnerability extended and reinforced at Hormuz, this time with international legitimacy attached to it. That is not just a risk for China, that is a strategic nightmare. So the first part of the Chinese calculation is actually very simple. If America wins here, China loses, not because Iran is morally pure, not because China loves Tehran, but because a successful American-led reopening under UN legitimacy would strengthen exactly the maritime order China has spent years trying to escape. Now let us move to the second layer, because this is where the veto becomes much more interesting. What happens if Hormuz does not reopen quickly on the surface? Yes, China gets hurt, prices rise, supply chains tighten, uncertainty grows, but that is only the short-term layer, and China does not think mainly in short-term layers. China thinks in decades, and from a long-term perspective, prolonged instability in Hormuz does something extremely important. It puts stress on the whole financial system built around Gulf energy flows. To understand that, you have to understand the petrodollar system. For decades, oil has been traded largely in dollars, especially through the Gulf. That means countries need dollars to buy energy. That constant demand for dollars helps sustain demand for American assets, American debt, and the wider financial architecture of U.S. power. So the dollar is not just a currency. It is one of the hidden foundations of American geopolitical reach. Now ask, what happens when a critical energy corridor stays unstable? Gulf exports become harder to move. The old recycling of oil, dollars, and American financial dominance comes under strain. Countries start asking uncomfortable questions. What if this system is not as reliable as it used to be? What if the maritime order behind it is now a source of risk? What if alternatives are no longer optional, but necessary? And that is exactly where China has been preparing for years. Yuan-based energy settlements, alternative payment rails, belt and road financial infrastructure, deeper integration with Russia and Iran. None of these systems fully replace the dollar in a stable world, but in a stressed world, a cracked world, a world where the old system feels less safe, they suddenly become much more attractive. So what looks like a crisis on the surface becomes an opportunity underneath. Every week that the Hormuz situation remains unresolved, the pressure on the dollar-based system increases. Every shock makes alternative mechanisms look less theoretical. Every disruption slowly weakens the assumption that American-led finance is the only serious game in town. That is why the veto is not just about ships. It is about systems. China was willing to absorb short-term pain because the long-term transformation may be far more valuable. Now, let us move to the third layer, because this is where many people dramatically underestimate Beijing. A lot of analysts say, fine, maybe the veto is clever, but China still needs oil. China still suffers if Hormuz is unstable. Yes, that is true. But it only matters if you assume China is improvising in real time. China is not improvising. China has spent years preparing for exactly this kind of disruption: strategic petroleum reserves, diversified suppliers, overland corridors, the China-Pakistan economic corridor, deeper logistics with Russia and Iran, massive domestic investment in solar, wind, nuclear, and grid capacity. This is not just climate policy or industrial policy. It is strategic resilience. It is China building a system that can absorb maritime shocks better than many of its competitors. So when a disruption like Hormuz hits, China does not experience it as pure panic. It experiences it as a stress test, painful, yes, but manageable. And when you compare that to other major economies, the contrast becomes important. Europe is deeply exposed. Japan is deeply exposed. South Korea is deeply exposed. Many U.S. allies have fewer buffers, fewer alternatives, and less political tolerance for prolonged energy pain. So the longer the disruption lasts, the more valuable China's preparation becomes. That changes the balance of power. Now let us go one layer deeper still, because there is also a legal and moral dimension to this veto that the Western press has tried to flatten out. China's ambassador argued that the resolution did not address the root causes of the crisis. Russia made a similar point. The proposal, in their view, was treating Iran's response as the problem while skipping over the escalatory actions that produced that response. Now, whether you fully agree with that framing is not even the central issue. The central issue is that this argument resonates well beyond Moscow and Beijing, because much of the global south has watched this pattern for decades: intervention first, justification later, military action framed as order maintenance, international law applied selectively, depending on who is using force and who is receiving it. So when China vetoes a resolution like this, it is not only making a geopolitical move, it is also making a narrative move. It is telling Asia, Africa, and Latin America that it will not automatically legitimize force under a system many countries already view as unevenly applied. That is politically valuable. It helps China position itself not merely as a rising power, but as a critic of selective enforcement and a defender of sovereignty language that resonates strongly outside the Western alliance system. And in geopolitics, narrative power matters. Wars are not fought only with missiles. They are fought with stories: who is escalating, who is defending, who is bending the rules, who is protecting them. That battlefield matters, because perception shapes alignment and alignment shapes power. Now step back and take the largest view of all. What happened in the Security Council on the 7th of April was not just about Hormuz, it was about the world system for years. People have talked about the transition from a unipolar world to a multipolar world as if it were an abstract theory. It is not abstract anymore. The veto made that brutally concrete, because what China and Russia demonstrated with one decision was simple. The UN Security Council is not America's rubber stamp anymore. There was a time, especially after the Cold War, when the United States could move through international institutions with an extraordinary degree of freedom. If it wanted intervention, pressure, or legal framing, it often found a way. Russia was weak. China was not yet ready to challenge the structure directly. That era is over, and the Hormuz veto shows it. America went to the UN seeking legitimacy for what it framed as a vital stabilization move. It did not get it, not because of procedure, not because of delay, but because two major powers looked at the proposal and said, no, that is a structural shift. It means there are now visible limits on what the United States can authorize through the old institutional order. Most people miss this because they are watching missiles and ships, but power is not decided only on the battlefield. It is decided across systems, military, economic, political, narrative. And if you want to know who is really gaining power, you have to look at all four at the same time, militarily. China did not fire a shot, yet it constrained the legal battlefield. Economically, it allowed continued stress on a dollar-centered energy system while standing on buffers it had prepared for years. Politically, it positioned itself as the defender of sovereignty against selective force. Narratively, it told a compelling story to much of the non-Western world. We are not the ones escalating. We are the ones refusing to rubber. Stamp it, that is an extraordinary return for one veto, no war, no mobilization, no direct confrontation, just leverage, timing, and institutional precision. Now let me address the biggest objection. People say China cannot want this for long. Eventually, Beijing has to support reopening Hormuz because China still needs the oil. Yes, eventually everyone wants the route functioning, but the real strategic question is not whether China can live with disruption forever. The real question is who runs out of time first, and that is where the picture changes. Again, America is burning through time faster than China is. The United States is spending military stockpiles, political capital, market confidence, and domestic patience. Public tolerance is not infinite. Financial tolerance is not infinite. Alliance patience is not infinite. Every week of instability raises pressure inside the American system. Iran, by contrast, has built its strategic culture around endurance. China has built its economic strategy around buffers. So delay itself becomes a weapon, and that is what the veto really did. It did not solve the crisis. It stretched it. It denied Washington a fast institutional win. It forced time to keep running. And in crises like this, the side that benefits from delay is often the side best prepared for attrition. That is why I think so many analysts are misunderstanding this conflict. They are treating it like a conventional military contest. It is not. It is a struggle over systems, endurance, legitimacy, and the shape of the next world order. Iran is fighting for survival, America is fighting for credibility, and China is fighting for something even bigger. The gradual erosion of a US-dominated world system that has constrained China's rise for decades. And what makes the Chinese move so impressive is that it advanced that objective at almost no direct military cost, no fleet battle, no missiles, no troops, just a single diplomatic weapon used at exactly the moment. Washington most needed a yes. That is what a veto really is at great power level. It is not procedure. It is a strategic weapon in legal form. It can delay, deny, frustrate, and redirect the course of a war without firing a shot. That is why this moment matters so much. Years from now, when people look back at this conflict, they may not say the turning point was a bombing campaign or a naval maneuver. They may say the turning point was the day China looked at the United States, looked at the Security Council, and with one word changed the trajectory of the entire crisis. That is why I think everybody missed the story. The veto was not hesitation. It was not confusion. It was not China simply protecting Iran. It was a deliberate move to deny America legitimacy, prolong stress on the old order, accelerate the value of alternatives, and show the world that the age of automatic U.S. authorization is over. And once you see that, the whole crisis looks different because this was never just about reopening a waterway. It was about who gets to define the rules of the world that comes after the old one starts to crack.